now we're on the last session. And to lead us in a discussion centered on energy adaptation strategies is Dr. Ellen Morris from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Dr. Morris.
Thank you very much. We are the last panel here, and we're mindful of the time and the late day, so we will have a very engaging and interactive discussion with a really robust panel from academia, industry, and advocacy around the transition into the clean energy sectors. So this panel is around energy adaptation strategies, and as we know, climate change will profoundly influence the adaptations that our energy infrastructure will need to accommodate. As weather patterns change, sea level rises, plant and animal distributions change, human migration patterns shift, and disease vectors are altered, energy infrastructure planning and implementation will face major challenges and opportunities that will impact capital investment, commodity pricing, and geopolitics. As we adapt to these changes, electricity generation and transmission infrastructure, resource developments, and transportation options will also need to adapt. In this session, we're going to explore with these panelists how climate adaptation will reshape the future geography of energy. And I will start from the vantage point of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This is a Department of Energy national lab doing foundational science, research and development that fills the gap from concept to market in energy efficiency, sustainable transport, renewable energy, and system integration and optimization. And I'm in a new role here at NREL, having taught at Columbia University in the School of International Public Affairs, working a lot on energy access in developing countries. And in this new role at NREL, I'm leading up the university engagement strategy for helping to build a stronger bridge with the research coming out of the lab, with the research that's being done with academia. So I'm really excited. And just so you know, I'm filling in for my colleague, Dave Mooney, who's in the program, and he had difficulty getting here, so I am taking over the mantle from my colleague, Dave Mooney. And just a couple of slides I wanted to go through. There you go. So on this first slide is a wind energy resource map. And the point here is that it represents around 40 trillion data points. And what you see there is a very high potential for renewable energy, wind energy, and most notably, also connected to the last speaker, is the importance of offshore wind and exploiting that. So I'm just going to flip through 3 slides, and I really want you to focus on the lower right-hand corner. This is the evolution of the US power sector since 1950 and the electricity generation mix over time. And in this first slide is, to the lower right, if you can't see it, is the renewable energy potential, wind, solar, et cetera, with hydro. And in the next slide, just to disaggregate it, you start to see non-hydropower renewables. And what's notable about this is in about 2007, you see a major uptick in renewable energy, again, related to many of the issues that we've heard about earlier today and yesterday, reductions in cost, more uptake, enabling policies, and customer choice being an important driver for that uptick in renewable energy. But what you also see on this chart is the associated downturn in coal as associated with plants being decommissioned, emission reduction requirements, incentives for renewable energy, and siting constraints. And let's see, in the next slide, it starts to lump all renewable energy together, which also gives you a very upward trend. Again, the other trends are the same as in the previous slides. And that's that. I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time and just move to this slide because I think it's quite important. because what it shows is, again, a snapshot, in this case in 2017, of what the trend was for US power sector energy mix. And what you see on the left-hand side with the large green and yellow are the capacity additions happening in 2017, dominated by natural gas and dominated by renewables. And in renewables specifically, it's around wind and solar. So clearly, this snapshot in 2017 is driving the trends that have happened in 2018 and beyond that my panelists will also talk about. Then on the right-hand side are the capacity retirements, again, most notably looking at the blue wedge there, which is around the retirement of coal-fired power plants. And on the bottom are the capacity additions looked at in a very different way, but highlighting along the x-axis the technologies, starting with wind, natural gas, and solar, and at the far right, in dark blue, coal. And so what you see is really this very dramatic pattern of the expansion of renewables and the decline of coal specifically. So when we think of geography and the wider world and the mapping of where these resources are and how this renewable energy deployment is going, this chart or this map really shows the technologies by color and the map of the world. And where you see is that China, not surprisingly, is out front in everything. US is still very much a player with 1,200 gigawatts of installed capacity. But I think most importantly, again, hearkening back to my roots working in international development, what you see is the continent of sub-Saharan Africa, the continent of Africa with sub-Saharan Africa, showing that obviously that's not a top country for renewable energy deployment except for in the case of South Africa. But I think for this audience and for the young people who are going to be taking the mantle from me and others who are working in this space, that presents the next huge market opportunity for renewable energy. And getting to that point requires technologies, business models, finance, policies, and the whole spectrum working together. So with that context and that sort of high altitude view of renewable energy development, I'm really happy to introduce my first panelist, who comes from the wind energy, and her name is Susan Sloan. She's the Vice President of State Affairs from the American Wind Energy Association, a trade association. And she's done a lot of work on developing wind technologies and promoting wind technologies and markets. Susan leads a team working on state policy issues covering 40 states across the country in legislative and regulatory affairs to build market opportunities for wind energy. During Susan's tenure at the American Association of Wind Energy, wind has grown from 1,800 turbines installed in the US to more than 54,000 today. And I'll ask that we can hold questions till everyone gets a chance to speak, and then we'll have a way to engage with you. So please keep in mind your questions as the presentations go along. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody today. As Ellen said, the wind has grown quite a bit. And so as we were talking about the title for the panel, or the concept of the panel, which is growing energy or strategies to grow energy, I thought of how much it's already grown just over the time when I've been working in wind. It has grown dramatically, and I think that it's a guide to how we can see it moving forward. We have a tradition of outperforming the forecasts that have been made over the last 15 years that I've been around the wind industry, and still this year we're seeing a dramatic amount of growth with 26% capacity additions in 2017, which was enormous. We have been one of the fastest growing energy sectors for the last 5 or 6 years. And so, I think that as you look at, this goes beyond any forecast that we have had, and I'll just anecdotally, I started out in this industry working in Texas, which is where I live, and we were advocating to the legislature that they should set policies that would allow more opportunity for the wind industry, and they did. But in the process, we had to discuss, what is the opportunity for wind, and what's it going to do to the grid, and how much is it going to cost, and all of those questions that we get from every policymaker, and as we're talking about a new technology. And we are cheaper than we predicted. Wind grew faster than was ever thought, and there has not been reliability problems on the ERCOT grid that were not projected, but that people were worried about. And the truth is that all of these things, as you grow incrementally, are workable. And I think that's a lesson across the country, and that certainly was a lesson in the Texas example. The economic benefits are many. We've got $145 billion of capital invested in the US today. We're paying about almost $270 million to landowners across the country. In 2017, as the industry grows, that will increase. We provide a lot of tax base to the rural economies that pays for county taxes and school taxes, and is enlivening rural areas where there has not been as much opportunity. It is a drought-proof crop for people who are living off their land by farming and ranching. And so there is a great amount of economic benefit that's already coming from wind today, and could continue. Cost reductions, as I think it sounds like has been talked about quite a bit, but the cost reductions have been significant, and that's really one of the main reasons we've seen the growth of wind. The economies of scale are critical. I think we've seen the same thing in many other industries, including the solar energy industry. We have seen a lot of optimization in our manufacturing sector. A lot more of it has come to the US. People have gotten good at it. The bigger manufacturing facilities are sited closer to where wind farms are. And so that, as that part of the industry has matured, it's gotten cheaper. The operations and maintenance on wind farms is much more predictable now and much lower cost than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And then there has been transmission built. And when you can reach the windiest areas or the right areas where people want to see wind farms sited, and where there is an excellent wind regime, as there is in much of the country, that really helps to allow for more development as well. We have a lot that are still under construction right now. And that tells you that there is still a lot of interest, both by the sellers, by the investors, by the buyers, to see more wind. And this map kind of shows you a lot of it's in that really windy area, which is the center of the country, which Ellen just showed on her presentation. So we'll still see a great amount coming in all of those things that I mentioned before: the capital investment, the landowner payments, the tax base. This is really, the power industry has, over time, as we've seen more wind and solar develop, it is becoming less of a fuel industry and more of a technology industry. And so the electricity industry is getting into the technology business. This is an example of how turbine sizes have grown over time. We're seeing more power come from every turbine. The swept area makes a big difference in how much power you can pull out of every turbine. And they're also very much, they are very much able to specialize in places of low wind area or high wind area, or somewhere in between, and And so there's a lot more technology choice, both with the turbines and the type of materials and that are in the turbines themselves, as well as the electronics, the controls of the turbines makes a big difference now, and we're getting much more technology based on those. The offshore, I think, has also been mentioned. It sounds like there's been, we're having the offshore moment right now. We have had numerous states, especially in the Northeast, who are now making a commitment to offshore for a variety of reasons. But we've got somewhere on the order of 8 gigawatts that are in the discussion pipeline, let's call it, because a number of states have said we want to get to a certain number of gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 or some number. Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Virginia, Connecticut, Maryland, all have made some level of commitment to offshore wind. And so I think in addition to other parts of the country, we're going to see a lot more of that, and that's going to help offshore wind get better. We have not had to do offshore wind in the United States because we have such fantastic wind resources throughout the center of the country and on the land. But I think as offshore wind technology and the capabilities are better, and there is a need for power on the coastal areas, we're seeing that really surge ahead. Important to especially the audiences I usually talk to, which are policymakers, we have about 105,000 jobs now in the wind industry today. The wind technicians were have been rivaling #1 and #2 fastest growing career in the country. And not only that, of course, we have all of the other construction, design, development, investment, all of the jobs that go into wind technicians. But this is a growing area, and as we talk about a transition to a carbon-free future, it's important to remember that that transition includes jobs in the new technologies that we're using. On the C&I front, we have in the first, second, and third quarters of this year, we have more PPAs or power purchase agreements from C&I companies than in all of last year or any previous year. The C&I purchases have, companies like Walmart, AT&T, Amazon, all of those have been buying a lot of wind, and that is part of what is driving some of this. Is there's a lot of customer demand. There's also wind taking a lot more risk in some of these purchases, and that is something that we as an industry are really looking at, is how do you make sure that you've got the right set of policies and the right kind of business models, which are also continually changing. This is such a young industry that there's just been a huge amount of evolution across the board in probably every aspect of this industry over the last 15 years. Finally, I want to leave you with, because no wind discussion would be complete without a transmission slide. Growth of the industry requires infrastructure. And if we build transmission in the right places, it is not only good for the overall reliability and redundancy of the grid for every electricity customer, but it also saves us money. We have seen that time and time again as we saw Texas build $7 billion of transmission over the last 10 years. We've seen the Midwest states and the Plain states also make significant investments in transmission, which allows you to reach those rural areas that need the economic development, that want to see wind sited, want to host that wind, and their wind regime is so good that it's cost effective for all of the customers who are then going to be receiving that. And not to mention, there's no carbon and there's no water use for areas where water use can be something that there's a lot of competition for. with the ag industry and cities and other competition for water. So we have, you know, as far as we're looking ahead and kind of forecasting or thinking about how we grow, we have a really good track record to look at and see what's worked, what hasn't, and as we continue to grow incrementally, we have seen that a lot of these issues, we can deal with them, and we have an industry that has been very open to looking at problems, addressing them, moving forward, and then growing faster than anybody has ever predicted. So thank you.
Thanks. So shifting gears to solar, our next speaker is Mr. Raffi Garabedian, and he is the Chief Technology Officer of First Solar. And he's going to speak today about where solar technology and PV is going and what the PV markets look like globally. Raffi is an expert on solar power, specifically photovoltaic manufacturing. At First Solar, he focuses on developing the potential of solar energy and raising the awareness of clean energy. His vision for a clean energy future includes improving energy efficiency and creating ways to reduce carbon footprints and lower water usage. So welcome, Raffi.
Thank you very much. And great job with my name, by the way. That's hard to do. Hey, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm a bit of an odd duck. I represent a corporation. But we're a corporation founded on the idea that new technologies can be a part of the solution to the global climate change problem, in particular carbon reduction. So I think it is topical, and hopefully our comments and our activities are of interest to you. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the company because I think it's probably helpful for you to get a picture, a snapshot of what a corporation involved in these kinds of activities looks like. So we are a technology and a manufacturing company. We have a global footprint of manufacturing. We're headquartered in Arizona, but our US manufacturing is in northwestern Ohio, and I'll touch on that in just a second. And our largest manufacturing footprint is in Malaysia and in Vietnam, which is a new factory we're just bringing up. I'll put up this slide here so you can get a little bit of the data in front of you. We manufacture about roughly 3 gigawatts of solar modules a year. And we're ramping up from that to over 7 gigawatts over the next couple of years. To put that in perspective, a coal power unit is about half a gigawatt in capacity. So you can do the math, right? We kind of currently offset about 5 or 6 coal power units a year with our production capacity. Now, globally, the entire photovoltaic industry is about 100 gigawatts of annual production. So, 200 coal units on a power basis, on a capacity basis. On an energy basis, of course, it's about a third of that because we only operate when the sun is up. And that's about a 30% capacity factor relative to coal. Nevertheless, it's a big industry, and we're putting a dent in the problem. And you've seen some of the slides. I'm not going to repeat kind of the big picture slides, but along with wind, we are the fastest growing new forms of energy, and it's driven largely by economics. So if you look back at my career in solar, I've been about 10 years in the industry. When I started, every one of our sales was driven by a subsidy. And it started out in Europe with the German feed-in tariff, which really launched our industry, created it. And today, still we have various economic incentives and mandates driving adoption. But more and more, we are seeing utilities actually independently procuring solar head-to-head against thermal generation, against natural gas and coal. And they're regulated. They're held to a metric of least cost, best fit procurement. And they're picking solar, they're picking wind. They're doing it because it's cheap. So we can produce solar-powered electricity today for around 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, $35 a megawatt hour. That's cheaper than you can build a new gas plant for. That's cheaper, well, in many places. And it's certainly cheaper than you can build a new coal power plant for, which is why as old power units age and they come off the grid, they're being replaced by renewables. In our history, we produced just under 20 gigawatts, 17 gigawatts of volume. We're also one of the largest project developers, certainly in the United States, and I actually think globally. We've got over 5 gigawatts of project development under our belts. So that's all the way from early stage siting through construction, procurement, and finance, structured finance of those projects, ultimately to sell. We don't keep and own the power plants. We don't have the cost of capital for that. We sell the power plants to financial investors who want to own 25-year assets that generate recurring income with very, very little maintenance and ongoing cost. More and more, we are also contracting and selling not just to independent power producers, but to, as I mentioned, to independent utilities, so to state-owned or consumer-owned and investor-owned utilities. And we're also contracting, similar to the wind industry, more and more with commercial and industrial customers, the likes of Apple, Facebook, Google, Walmart, you name it. A couple of other things. We have a unique technology. The bulk of the solar manufacturing industry is now in China. We've heard a little bit about China and their energy needs and their energy growth. That country is a leader in new energy technologies. We are the largest non-Chinese, non-Korean manufacturer of solar panels. We use a very different technology than the rest of the industry, which is based on crystalline silicon. We use a thin film technology called cadmium telluride. It's a really effective technology. It's very high efficiency, but most importantly, it has a very, very beneficial environmental footprint in manufacturing. So it's a low energy input, low water use manufacturing technology. We can churn solar panels out very, very quickly and very, very environmentally, with a very low environmental footprint. I mentioned that our US operations are in northwestern Ohio. Anybody have a guess why? Somebody might have a guess. All right, I'll tell you. So solar modules, when you look at one, what are they made of? They're made of glass. The glass industry in the United States grew up in northwestern Ohio, largely because of the availability of natural gas to fire float lines, and the availability of offtakes to the automotive industry actually created the flat glass industry. So that's why we're based there. The technology we use is very, very synergistic with the production of glass. All right, I'm going to change gears now completely. Who's heard of the duck curve? Okay, a few hands this time, excellent. So the duck curve is a graphical representation popularized in California of what can happen to the demand and supply balance on an energy grid, on an electric grid, when a whole lot of solar is built, and that solar generates, of course, when the sun is up, but that's not the peak in demand. The peak in demand in California is in the morning and in the afternoon. When you lay these two on top of each other and you have a lot of must-run assets on the bottom of your generation stack, so things like imports that are contracted that you can't turn off for legal reasons, or nuclear plants that you don't want to shut off, you get this inversion in the net load, what's called the net load in utility terms, and it looks kind of like a duck. So they call it the duck curve. This has been heralded as a problem statement, right? In California as a good example, but on most modern grids, when you hit about 20, maybe 25% penetration level of variable renewable generation, solar and wind, which can be predicted but does vary with the resource, then you start to get integration challenges. People worry about the stability and reliability of the grid and how they're going to manage that supply-demand relationship. Right? Now, the fact of the matter is on the technical merits, the grid is much, much more flexible than that 20% number I just gave you really represents. And this is what I'm showing here is a chart from our friends at NREL, National Renewable Energy Labs, and Aaron Bloom is, I want to thank him for providing some guidance on how to use this chart. This is not my work, but I'll try to represent it properly. This is a mashup of a couple of different studies. Now, these studies are incredibly complex. They look at every power line on the US grid and every balancing node on that grid, and they run economic dispatch models against those energy sources and sinks for every hour of every day in a year. It's a supercomputer problem. It actually takes a full day of supercomputer time to run the model I'm about to show you. What the colored dots represent are different resources, and I guess some of my, here we go, good. Different resource types and locations in a future scenario. The scenario they looked at here was a mashup of the Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study, 30% renewables on the eastern grid, with a 50% renewable content in the western grid in California. So those two studies were put together into a single study. And what we're going to look at here is how the power flows from one region to another in the country over the transmission grid as the day progresses, as a typical day. We chose a day in May, which is a high renewable generation day, combination of wind and solar both high. Why is this important? Well, geography. The power distribution grid in the United States and in most developed countries is an incredible asset. It's a very complex, very powerful, and very resilient way to take advantage of geographic diversity, both in demand and supply of energy. And this has been known for 100 years. Since the grid was conceived, it was built for this purpose. But now, as we have variable generation coming online in greater and greater quantities, we can use the same technology, the same system that we've built, with only minor modification, with slight additions of transmission, and more intelligent controls, to integrate very high levels of renewables into our lives. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's see if the animation works. Okay, the line you're seeing there is the sun, right? So that's day and night. The arrows represent power flows from one balancing region to another. And I think this is going to loop back again, I hope. Let's see if it does. Right, so you see, for example, in the southeast here, you see a lot of solar being generated and being shipped to the northeast, right? Geographic and resource diversity. So we're sharing our neighbors' resources, and you'll actually see the lines flip. You'll see the directions flip. I mean, to put it really, really simply, right, we're stronger together. So the notion of local generation and local consumption is actually, I think, a very misplaced notion when it comes to the electric utility system. Actually, there's strength in numbers. There's strength in geographic diversity, both in generation and consumption, and the grid allows us to harness that and get to levels of integration of renewables, 50%, which I think 10 years ago when I started in the solar industry, that was considered a pipe dream. And there's no new technology here. We're just learning how to use what we've already built more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Raffi. Very interesting presentation, and glad that you highlighted the Energy System Integration Facility at NREL. So our next speaker is Dr. Vasilis Fthenakis. He is here from Columbia University. He's the founder and director of the Center for Life Cycle Analysis. He has worked a lot on sustainable solar PV market expansion and life cycle considerations for the solar industry. Vasilis' mission is to guide technology and energy policy decisions toward a renewable electricity grid. He has done leading work showing the technical, economic, and geographical feasibility of using solar power along with other renewables to satisfy almost 70% of the electricity needs of the US by 2050. Thank you very much, Vasily.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks to the AGS for the invitation to give this lecture on my alma mater. Actually, Ellen and Raffi, they refer to the adult age, but I grew professionally with photovoltaics, and I know photovoltaics and the companies since their infancy. That infancy was back in the mid-'80s, beginning of 1990s, and I had from Brookhaven National Lab, where I spent the last 36 years, a program funded by the Department of Energy to assist the startups in photovoltaics. And we did assist about 20 companies in the United States from small to large. First solar was solar cells then, and started in Perrysburg, Ohio, in Toledo, Ohio, 100 people, 110 people. Raffi just told me there are 4,000 people now. And we helped the industry to maintain safe and environmentally friendly facilities. Is very important. Always in photovoltaics, in solar, probably in wind too, they were environmentally conscious people. And that's what really was the dynamic that made those companies great. Always thinking about how to preserve the environment, how to have safe, how to minimize risks, because there are risks in everything that we do, in everything that we elect to do, how to minimize that. So today we talk a lot about the climate change, and especially in this conference, and talking about adaptation strategies. Perhaps something that we haven't highlighted here, although is obvious, is the other challenge that we have with energy, and that is the challenge of finite resources. When we talk about sustainability, we talk about intergenerational issues, not only about us, not only about 50 years, many, many, many generations. Unless we go into renewable energy, we don't have sustainable energy. So in addition to the climate change, and obviously we have several options, we have to think about risks, and we have to think about technologies like wind and solar that not only they mitigate climate change, but they also give the new renewable generation that we need. Some of the technologies in the mixture, they don't do that. So let's think about that. I think I'm going to give, actually, since I started with chronology, a little backwards, perhaps, sequence. We started looking into the big picture because we knew that the industry can do it. We're very close to the industry for many years, and we could project with the industry what can be the next step. So back in 2008, with collaborators at NREL and in other places, we did a study there where we projected the technical, economic, and geographical feasibility of solar with wind and other renewable energies to provide 69% of the electricity use demand by 2050 in a highly electrified society. 10,500 terawatt-hours, not only the 4,000 that we're talking about, because we projected that would be electric vehicles, about 340 million electric vehicles by 2050. So that's a big picture. You can see some numbers there about what we projected for 2020. I think 46 for PV is 58 now in the US. 72 for wind is about 95 now for US. CSP projections, they were not as good. In the beginning, we didn't know which would be the winner. Anyway, but keep this in mind, because all the estimates over the years for solar and wind were underestimates. So at that time, in 2008, people thought that we were out on a limb, but actually we're conservative. And a very big part of that plan was a transmission that Susan just mentioned. And you recall that I had several questions about transmission. What is happening in China now with that waste energy transmission is wonderful. There is technology there. We can really take account of geographical diversity. We had made calculations that we could get with the transmission actually about 2 cents per kilowatt hour more if it is a well-utilized high voltage DC and integration of the 3 interconnects of the United States, and it would still be cheaper than storage. At the end, we may need some storage, but we can minimize the cost of storage. Storage could cost, at that time, we took the most affordable, that was compressed air, pumped hydro. But now we know we know batteries, the $150 per kilowatt hour. They can give us storage for about 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And then we can enable a much higher penetration of PV. What you see on the graph on the top is actually the projections that we did on the declines of photovoltaics based on First Solar's product, because it was the least production cost product. And at that time, they had in Germany a system that cost about $4 per watt, and the module prices were close to $1. We forecasted that it can go to $1 for the system, $1.20, and 50 cents per kilowatt hours. They proved us very conservative. Kudos to Raffi's team. They are now, I think, 35, 40 cents for the module, and the system prices, they are below $1. And actually, unsubsidized deployment with only the ITC. So what we projected is that when the cost grid parity happens, that is happening now for wind and solar, and we thought that it will happen in 2020, it happened already last year or the year before that. After that, we actually projected the feasibility, but it needs political foresight for this to become a reality, of drastically escalating deployment. We took into account the phasing out of the old power plants, the coal and natural gas and hydro and whatever. We took into account that, and we actually have a gradual, but after 2030, we think that it could be almost exponential growth. Now, at that point, we can get, by 2050, a reduction of carbon dioxide emissions nationally by 62% of the 2005 levels, when we get 69% of solar and wind into the grid. The more detailed study that Susan just mentioned from the DOE that was done by NREL with all these supercomputer-based models, initially they had projections lower than ours, but they did an update 2 years ago and last year where they added storage, and they get 2030 about to the same actually levels that we projected, but then they don't go so high. Perhaps they are actually considering better the political reality than we do. We didn't think about political burdens, and we are actually inspired by the international policies. We're inspired by what was happening in Germany, what was happening in other European countries. Now, what is happening in China is also inspiring. Now, the prices have gone down, so you probably are aware of the prices, and when we're talking about electricity, pricing is very important because you need affordable electricity and you compete with other means of electricity. I'm not going to give detail there, but the big decline in the prices are actually enacted for the most part from big solar farms like the ones from SunPower and First Solar in the United States and Trina in China and so on. Prices have gone down to about $1 for those and $2.5 per watt for residential. So there is actually a distinction there between the prices, more soft cost in residential, and the Department actually of Energy is trying to reduce this. So let me now just show a few very simple images that I hope that will be remembered and show the promise, not only the current, but the future promise of photovoltaics. To me, they look beautiful. Okay, so you can see the area picture there of a higher than 1 gigawatt power plant by First Solar in our desert. There is a 750 megawatt by SunPower. There are several actually very large that they produce very low price electricity. Now the bids in the United States are lower than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. That was the target. I think the bids now are close to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And the beautiful systems, let's say, in Australia, in university, I was very glad to hear from our friends in ASU that actually ASU now is the world, actually, in the university, the world's record 20 megawatt in the campus. I'm very glad to hear that. Unfortunately, we don't have much solar at actually Columbia. And the system that you can see there on the top right is my system at Dix Hills, 21 years old. So we did the system in 1997. It handled Sandy very well. I lost 15 trees, and I lost actually a part of my roof in the garage. The system was intact, and the same inverters, 21 years, although they came with a 5-year guarantee. What I'm getting into, solar is very resilient, very resilient. We're talking about the storms. Yesterday we had a storm. Today we have sunlight. It happens typically after the storms. Solar can withstand that. And when we're talking about the challenges, resiliency, reliability is very, very, very important too. We can have distributed solar and adds into the resiliency of the grid. We have big, actual economic losses with the blackouts and so on after the storms. Solar can help a lot into this actually dimension. This is a triangle that my students know that I love very much. That's kind of abstract representation of what we think are the basic metrics of sustainable development. So you know what is sustainable development, obviously. That is development that satisfies the needs of the current generation without compromising the needs of the future generations to satisfy their own needs. So it has to be renewable. Otherwise, really, energy development is not sustainable. And it has to be affordable, not only for the rich Americans and Germans, but affordable for the developing world, 1 billion people that don't have electricity. So we have been studying on that, and I gave you the numbers that prove the affordability, and the industry is doing even better than that, continues to do that. Resource availability. In some technologies, including actually the cadmium telluride, there are minor elements from the production of base metals used there, and then they cannot be directly mined, so we looked into those resources, also into land resources, and now with batteries, we're looking into lithium and cobalt resources. There are a lot of resources there, but we have to project there in a reliable and valid way. This is part of the studies we do at Columbia, and also we look into environmental impact. As I mentioned early on, we're actually looking at how solar can stay environmentally friendly, and Raffi actually gave you a picture already, because the technologies are very efficient in terms of the energy they use and the energy they produce. So since I have only 4 or 5 minutes left, I'm going to skip the big issues. There are so many publications out there. Probably all of you know what we mean about material resources. There are a lot of materials out there. So solar is not really constrained by materials availability. Is perhaps constrained by land availability? We can talk about that. Is it perhaps constrained by the energy that you need in manufacturing? Let's talk about that, because those are some perceptions that they persist. Unfortunately, I was called actually to help a company in North Carolina the other day, because there is a perception there that solar can pollute the environment. I mean, nothing can be emitted during the operation of solar, nothing. We have glass and encapsulation that obviously withstand the different thermal cycles and the rain and so on. Nothing can be emitted. There is no pollution coming out of it. Another myth that we actually dispersed is that solar uses too much energy. I will make I will show this actually descent. This is a very drastic descent. Every symbol shows energy payback times that is better than the previous one. You may have seen the learning curves of photovoltaics, how the price is reduced by about 20% with every doubling of capacity. You have this drastic reduction in the energy payback time, that is the energy it takes for the system to generate all the energy that is used in the life cycle, from the mining of the elements, the production of the cells, the production of the balance of system, the structures, all the way to the end of life. Now it's down to 6 months in the sunny areas, only 6 months. So if you have a system that generates electricity for 30 years, the first 6 months they pay off to generate actually all the energy, and then 29.5 years they are kind of energy burden-free. This is very important, and this points out to what would be the best use of the remaining of our fossil fuels. The best use of that would be to do more, to manufacture more solar, perhaps manufacture more wind. That would be the best use, because it's a better energy return on energy investment. It can be up to 60 times more energy that you can get from solar than the energy you put into solar from a grid that has a lot of fossils there. And it uses less land than coal. Of course, we know that if solar is at the top of a house, it doesn't use incrementally any land, but the big systems on the ground use a considerable amount of land. And we looked at all the data, historical data, in the amount of land in the coal life cycle, with surface mining. About 75% of the mining in the United States of coal is from surface. Coal uses more land than photovoltaics. And it does not disturb the land. Obviously, you see, you can have pasturing between the modules, and you can have pollinators between those. You could have solar on landfills, on brown fields. That's the bottom left. You could have low-height crops between the strings. You can have solar covering parking lots. You can solar on large commercial flat roofs. So very good, useful, actually, applications. It combines, as I mentioned before, actually beauty. You can have building integrating photovoltaics. And it also changes lives in the developing world. Obviously, this is one of the fundamental, actually, benefits of solar, that we can go off-grid, you can have microgrids, you can have solar in residences, and it helps the lives, it improves the lives, especially of the future generations. So I will leave actually a few points to discuss further, that solar energy can supply a large fraction of our energy needs, and I know that many believe that they are all of the above. I do believe that solar has a major role there. Not each of all of the above is equally important, I think. We can discuss that. And also something I didn't have time to really articulate is solar enables new industries. Solar enables storage. We have more actually assets into storage because of EVs in batteries and because of solar and wind. We have actually a new industry in desalination being created from solar, because you need more fresh water from saline water, and it takes a lot of energy, a lot of electricity. Solar can provide that. We can talk about this and about the critical challenge for the next 50 years of the humanity that many of you could recall that list by the Nobel laureate Richard Smalley, where he put energy at the top, and water and food and environment and poverty and security and so on, with decline in actually priority, because if you resolve the energy challenge, you can, to some degree at least, alleviate or address the other challenges. Solar enables new industries. Desalination in the chemical industry, we're talking about solar fuels now. We're talking a big transformation that is not only in the power generation, but actually there is an effect in several industries, and as I mentioned, grid resiliency and so on. And the last actually item that I would leave for discussion is when we compare prices, the external cost of electricity are not accounted there. And we wrote a lot academically on that, but I think that's something we need to do, to monetize the external cost and benefits of electricity. If you compare with coal and natural gas, there are a lot of external costs, environmental costs, in the health of the miners. The CO2, NOx, the particulates, although we have ESPs and the fabric houses in our coal power plants that are up to 99% efficient, that 0.1% that goes through, it has big effects. We have the particulates, we have the mercury, and so on. We don't account for those costs when we compare prices of solar with fossil, and we should start accounting for those. There is a way to monetize those. There is a whole book by the National Academy of Sciences about the hidden cost of energy. There are studies by the Harvard Medical School that point that the external cost of coal, they can be from 2 to 18 cents, depending on real generation of coal. We should start accounting for those costs when we compare prices. Thank you.
So next up is my friend, Marilyn Brown, Dr. Marilyn Brown. She is from Georgia Tech, one of the powerhouses for engineering. She's the Regents and Brooks Byers Professor of Sustainable Systems at Georgia Institute of Technology and formerly with Oak Ridge National Labs. And she's going to talk today about distributed generation, electricity and transportation, integrative systems perspectives. And Marilyn's research focuses on the design and impact of policies aimed at accelerating the deployment of innovations on the customer side of the electric meter. Dr. Brown served as presidential appointee on the board of directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority, where she helped bring the nation's most recent nuclear reactor online, put the agency on track to reduce its CO2 emissions by 60% in 2020, and develop the concept of an energy efficiency power plant. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay, good. Yeah. Well, the reason I arrived late on the stage was I was talking with one of the AV technicians explaining this was not a lightning session. So you can all thank me later, but now that we're here and I'm between you and the final session and the reception, I'm going to try to make it as much of a lightning approach as I can. You've seen from the presentation so far that the energy system globally and in the United States is being transformed. You've heard a lot in particular about the decarbonization of the electric grid, but we also have the electrification of transportation. And the combination of those two changes provides a novel type of adaptation strategy that I want to talk about in my few minutes. And that is the role of grid-integrated electric vehicles. Okay, thanks. Yep. I know that Mike Pascoletti expected me to be talking about energy efficiency because that's really been my career focus of research. Energy efficiency, of course, is one of the biggest consumer side of the meter resource. One of the EIA graphs that just was published a few weeks ago showed that it's responsible for as much electricity as we are consuming today. That is, if we were using electricity as inefficiently today as we did in the 1970s, just after the Arab oil embargo, we would have 100% more electricity being generated. It saved us 100%. And it's the cheapest and the cleanest, and no, I'm not talking about cold showers and warm beer. This is not about suffering. But I'm going to put all of that aside because that part of the customer side of the meter, while still interesting and still high potential for improvements, is not as fascinating to me at the moment as this integration of electric vehicles into the grid. Of course, also on the customer side of the meter, we have many other resources to distributed solar microgrids, demand response. I'll touch on some of those. The shift to distributed resources is happening in the electric sector as well. Hard to put all of this into perspective. We have 14 million customers today selling solar back to the grid. Raise your hand if you are, please. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 5%, 6%, 10% of you. It's very hard to get, I can't find that statistic in all of the data that I browse around. I know how many gigawatts are being bought by utilities, but I don't know how many people there are that are selling it back. You know, if we had, say, 10 of these million electric customers being residential customers of utilities across the country, that'd be about a 10% penetration. We have about 1% of our total electricity capacity now being provided by distributed solar. A lot of distributed combined heat and power providing electricity in various parts of our industrial system. We have 16 million customers participating in wholesale markets or demand response bids, so using time varying rate programs. There's a lot of action on the customer side of the meter. And emerging is, this last bullet, that we have about 500,000 electric vehicles now being managed by utilities. So a new and emerging source of customer activity. And as we think about the challenges facing the electric grid and transportation, one of those that has been rising to the top of our dialogue has been the issue of grid resilience. With so much variable renewable electricity, we have a more challenging supply to demand situation given that you can't store electricity. Someone described electricity to me as it's the commodity you can't see, but if you touch it, you die. It is so complicated, and you know, you just it's fun to think about. So the concept of grid resilience includes absorbing shocks in order to remain operational, managing disruptions as they unfold, getting back to normal as soon as possible, and then learning from all of that and recycling. So we see grid resilience as a problem on the transmission system, in the distribution system, and even at the feeder scale. I'm going to talk mostly about the distribution system, but keep in mind that we do have a lot of demand side and of the meter activity in the transmission system. With the new FERC Order 1000, we need to consider what the demand side can do before we build a new transmission line. So the same concept applies at the distribution scale as well. So thank you, Raffi, for describing the duck curve. Now you see what it looks like. My students don't always get it when I try to describe it in words. So you have the belly of the duck is the time when solar is generating so much of the electricity. This is in the state of California. The belly of the duck drops, and then as the sun sets, the grid is responsible for ramping demand up, in this case for the state of California, by 13 gigawatts in 3 hours, right? So that's the problem of resilience that we have as we have more and more solar. That the shape of the duck's belly is changing as you penetrate, as more and more solar is on the system. There was a study done in Texas, which I like to quote. It was part of the staff report of the Department of Energy that was published last year. It says that in the state of Texas, in ERCOT, if it had 25% solar, the next solar system would only drop 5%, would only be 5% on the Texas peak, right? Because we've moved the peak. The peak is no longer, the grid doesn't meet a peak anymore in the late afternoon, early evening. It's shifting to the later evening hours when the sun's no longer available to help out. And as a good geographer, we also have a duck that's walking. We have a really complicated geospatial system to manage as well. So I took as an example the boroughs of New York City. So it used to be on the left side there, you see Manhattan had the peak demand, and so did some of the boroughs. But as we've had more and more distributed generation, you see that, and as the duck curve has penetrated, the peak is now in Queens and in Brooklyn. And so power companies have to figure out not just how to reshape their distribution in time, but also in space. And can't wait to see what's going to happen when Amazon HQ2 arrives in Queens. So I've been playing with the idea of what would happen if electric vehicles could sell their grid resilient services back to electric companies, right? There was one estimate that was published a year or two ago about the value that an electric vehicle owner might get from a power company if they were to plug their car in and make it accessible when the electric company needed a frequency regulation. And the estimate ranged from $650 to about $1,200 a year. So for that one service, which is shown on the right side of the screen, and that is the vehicle selling its services back to the grid, that electric vehicle could be that much cheaper if the grid were ready to take that service. Other services exist as well. Capacity firming, right? In this highly variable state of the grid, very important service. Voltage control services, reserves as well. And on the left side of the chart, you see how cars can be used if they are charged by utility companies using smart coordinated charging systems. So instead of charging when you're in a peak mode, you charge, of course, when you're wanting to fill the valley, and you clip that peak. And if you need electricity, as Susan, you know, sometimes ERCOT does, because there's so much wind, they have no place to put it, you just plug in those cars and let those cars absorb that in the negative demand response mode. In the middle is all the fun stuff about how electric vehicles can help as emergency backup. You know, what if we had had bi-directional electric vehicles in Puerto Rico, or even more, at Fukushima? They did try to plug car batteries in there, but you know, they didn't have enough of them. So we need to figure out how to scale up this opportunity for a resilience pathway that blends these two transformations. We know that we have prosumers today, and you could consider an electric vehicle plugged in and selling its ancillary services to an electric company as a prosumer, selling just yet one more product, smart charging. In fact, you know, I've got all this. I could open up my garage. I could make it into a business. Come and charge in my garage, too. You don't need to buy your own charging device. Lots of opportunities, but they're all onesies and twosies. We need to work on moving from, I've got a house, I've got my solar, I've got my EV, I've got my battery, to someone is going to aggregate that for hundreds of thousands of households and make it into a business that can really scale up. So in order to do that, we've got to look at the options and the roles that different stakeholders could play. Always important if the stakeholders who have a vested interest in the current system can play a role in the new system, right? We know that from our social sciences. So on the top left, we have the vehicle owners. Well, what role could they play? Think, for instance, about fleet owners, fleet managers in particular. I'm moving into a project looking at the small delivery truck fleet owners in cities, if they had their bidirectional charging available. Down the lower left, original equipment manufacturers. Who's going to own the charging infrastructure? You know, what's the role of a vehicle of rental companies? Who's going to provide the gasoline car backups to the EV owners when their range anxiety becomes reality? Upper right, how about non-utility participant, new companies? You know, a lot of the smart PhD students in the room might be able to think of ways that they could spin off a company. Perhaps they could offer a subscription, or they could partner with ride-sharing services. They could lease infrastructure and lease vehicles and make them available to be able to sell back this grid resilience product. And of course, their utilities, bottom right, who knows what they're going to do? Maybe they will want to own the charging infrastructure. It's really it's to be seen who's going to play the role of the market aggregator. So this is a Energy Information Administration forecast of storage, utility scale storage in the US. And you see on the left, I'm sorry, it's got, the left has its forecast for wind, the middle has its forecast for utility scale solar, and the right is the forecast for utility scale storage, right? So utility scale storage forecast is teeny. It goes up to 20 gigawatts by mid-century. Now, let's say we had 100,000 electric vehicles, and each one of them could plug in and offer 5 kilowatts to their power company. That's 500 gigawatts, and that doesn't include all those trucks that I was talking about. Anyway, there's lots to be done. Some states are out there beginning to grow their storage capacity. California has directed its utilities to acquire 0.5 gigawatt of storage. Massachusetts has ordered some procurements. New York, Maryland, Nevada has passed a storage incentive program. So we're moving in the right direction, but the pace of change is slow. So in conclusion, we have an opportunity here to blend our transportation and our electricity transformation to create complementarity, a new type of adaptation strategy. With renewables, electric vehicles are that much cleaner, right? And with electric vehicles, our grid is that much more resilient. So next year, I hope we'll get to talk more about transportation in combination with electric power. Or if you don't want to wait that long, this doesn't have my new book on it. Sorry. Columbia University Press will, by this time next year, have published my new book, which is called Empowering the Great Energy Transition, and we talk a bit about what I've presented today. Thank you very much.
So I'm mindful of the time. Do we have time for questions? One question. So maybe I'll ask the question then. So a lot of what we focused on today has been about US markets, US potential, US energy transition happening, which is very exciting. But as I alluded to in my opening remarks, really the biggest markets on the horizon for renewable energy and energy efficiency are in emerging economies. And some of the developing countries that I'm talking about are the countries that have the most difficulty attracting investment, the most difficulty with long-term energy transitions, and thinking about how to open up those markets to investment for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and even electric vehicles that you're talking about. And these countries are, as you know, the countries that are most likely to be suffering from climate change, the effects of climate change. And so since this meeting is about geography and the wider world and the mapping of the world and thinking about the global situation, I wanted to ask each of you to just briefly, in a couple of sentences, to talk about how do you reconcile the challenges faced in developing countries with the tremendous growth of solar, wind, transportation, microgrids, et cetera, that you've all talked about. Would you like to go first, Susan?
Sure. I will say I represent the American Wind Energy Association, so we're really focused on how we grow here. But I think that when you look at the emerging countries, I think that by the U.S. being a leader, which we are in deploying wind across the country, developing the economies of scale and standards and other things that come with building an industry, I think those things serve to lower the costs and build a better product. And I can say that quite a few of the companies that are members of the American Wind Energy Association are developing across in those emerging markets. So I think by us being a leader and building a good product, we can take that abroad.
And do you see investment flowing in that direction?
I see investment flowing into a lot of, I think it's harder on a utility scale for some of those countries without a strong grid. So, we're seeing more microgrids that are coming about that are, they may include some utility scale generation. And so there is some opportunity there.
Raffi, what do you think, coming from the solar industry, about those opportunities more globally in the developing emerging economies?
In the interest of time, I'll keep it really brief. We do an awful lot of business in India. India is one of the fastest adopters of solar electricity, and they are building out transmission to accommodate that. China is the largest, the fastest growing market for solar solar systems. And again, transmission and distribution is a big part of their overall plan. The nut that I don't know how to crack is Africa, and you know, if anybody has thoughts, I would be all ears. But I mean, the way I look at Africa, there's a broader economic development problem and finance problem that I wish I knew how to solve.
Vasily, quickly.
I have a very quick answer because I want to leave more time for questions from the audience. I think that the audience
I think we're out of
here,
time, though.
And perhaps. So I think I see two parallel rules. We don't forget that affordability came because of big scales in Germany first, in the United States, in other countries, developing countries, and they make it more affordable for the whole world. So we need actually those two parallel paths to continue, and for energy technology transfer from the developed countries to the rest of the world to be amplified. So this is really what we need to. We need to keep the incentives in the developed countries and make it technology even cheaper, and technology transfer, which will bring actually also the funding mechanism. And the funding mechanism that I see there will be actually government and private together. So there are a lot of associations, a lot of NGOs that they're investing in developing countries, but they need the technology to become even more affordable, and it's happening.
Thank you. And Marilyn, do you see transportation, electric vehicles finding their way, investments in developing countries?
Oh, I do think that electric bikes and electrification is going to be very important in the developing world. And when we talk about new technologies for development, we have to consider all of the equity issues we've been talking about in the last few days. I know that we are strong on markets. The market signals have to be there if we're going to draw investment. But we also need to remind ourselves that we're in this problem of 1.2 versus 2 or 3 degree C rise of global temperatures, primarily because of the industrialized world. And there's an obligation to help provide a development path for other countries. I did have a couple of publications cited in the 1.5 degrees C report that Diana Lieberman talked about, and both of them underscored the importance of energy efficiency going forward because it is the cheapest. It makes transitions more affordable, but it's not as applicable to the developing world because they don't have the excess abusive overuse that we do. And so I do want to say equity is all over both the global issues, but it's also squarely a problem here in the US. Our transformation could be one in which inequality is exacerbated, so we need to pay attention to how we develop too. We've got some problems. Problems.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we've really touched on a lot of interesting topics, and I really want to thank you for being the last and most awesome panel. Thank you.